Nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophical position that life lacks inherent meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value. This worldview suggests that moral principles, religious beliefs, and social institutions are fundamentally baseless and that existence itself is without objective significance. Nihilists argue that traditional sources of meaning, such as God, morality, or human progress, are illusions or social constructs rather than genuine foundations for life. The term originates from the Latin word nihil, meaning nothing. Nihilism emerged prominently in 19th-century philosophy, particularly through the works of philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who both described and critiqued nihilistic tendencies in modern society. However, nihilism is not necessarily a prescription for despair or inaction. Some nihilists view the absence of predetermined meaning as liberating, suggesting that individuals are free to create their own values and purposes. Different forms of nihilism exist, including metaphysical nihilism, which denies the existence of concrete objects, and moral nihilism, which rejects the existence of moral truths. While often associated with pessimism, nihilism can serve as a starting point for authentic self-creation and genuine philosophical inquiry into the nature of existence. The Trolley Problem. The Trolley Problem is a thought experiment in ethics that explores the moral distinction between killing and letting die. The scenario presents a runaway trolley heading toward 5 people tied to the tracks. You can pull a lever to divert the trolley to a side track, where it will kill 1 person instead of 5. Most people intuitively feel it is morally acceptable to pull the lever, saving 5 lives at the cost of 1. However, a variation complicates this intuition. In the Fat Man version, you stand on a bridge next to a large person. Pushing this person off the bridge would stop the trolley, again saving 5 lives by sacrificing 1. Most people find this morally unacceptable, despite the identical numerical outcome. This paradox highlights the difference between intended and merely foreseen consequences, known as the doctrine of double effect. It also reveals tensions between utilitarian thinking, which focuses on maximizing overall well-being, and deontological ethics, which emphasizes the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions regardless of consequences. The Trolley Problem demonstrates how moral intuitions can conflict and reveals the complexity of ethical decision-making in situations involving competing values and the sanctity of human life. The Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus is a classical paradox in philosophy that questions the nature of identity and continuity over time. The thought experiment describes a ship that undergoes gradual replacement of its parts during long voyages. As planks rot and sails tear, they are replaced with new materials. Eventually, every original component has been substituted. The fundamental question emerges, is this still the same ship that originally set sail? This paradox extends beyond physical objects to profound questions about personal identity, consciousness, and the persistence of entities through change. If you replace every cell in your body over time, are you still the same person? The dilemma becomes more complex when considering that someone might collect all the original discarded parts and reconstruct them into another ship. Various philosophical positions attempt to resolve this paradox. Some argue that continuity of function or purpose maintains identity, while others focus on the gradual nature of change versus sudden replacement. The Ship of Theseus illustrates fundamental tensions in how we understand persistence, change, and identity. It remains relevant in contemporary discussions about consciousness, artificial intelligence, and the nature of selfhood in an ever-changing world. Hedonism. Hedonism is the philosophical doctrine that pleasure is the highest good and the primary motivation for human action. This ethical theory suggests that the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain should guide moral decisions and life choices. Hedonists argue that happiness, understood as the presence of pleasure and absence of suffering, constitutes the ultimate goal of human existence. Ancient Greek philosopher Aristippus first articulated hedonistic principles, later refined by Epicurus, who distinguished between different types of pleasures and emphasized the importance of mental tranquility. Epicurus advocated for simple pleasures and warned against pursuing intense but temporary gratifications that might lead to greater suffering. Modern hedonism encompasses various forms, from psychological hedonism, which claims humans naturally seek pleasure, to ethical hedonism, which prescribes pleasure seeking as morally correct. Critics argue that hedonism oversimplifies human motivation and may lead to short-sighted decisions that ignore long-term consequences or moral obligations to others. Contemporary philosophers debate whether hedonism adequately addresses complex human values like justice, knowledge, and meaningful relationships. Some argue that certain experiences have intrinsic worth beyond their pleasurable qualities, while others maintain that all valuable experiences ultimately reduce to forms of pleasure or satisfaction. Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that judges the rightness of actions based on their consequences, specifically their ability to maximize overall happiness or well-being for the greatest number of people. Developed by philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the 18th and 19th centuries, this consequentialist approach evaluates moral decisions through a calculus of pleasure and pain, seeking to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Bentham proposed a quantitative approach, measuring pleasures and pains by their intensity, duration, and likelihood. Mill refined this by introducing qualitative distinctions, arguing that some pleasures are inherently more valuable than others. He famously stated that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Utilitarianism offers practical guidance for policymaking and personal decisions by providing a clear criterion for moral evaluation. However, it faces significant criticisms. Critics argue that it may justify intuitively wrong actions if they produce better overall outcomes, potentially sacrificing individual rights for collective benefit. The theory also struggles with measurement problems, as comparing different people's well-being proves difficult in practice. Modern variations include rule utilitarianism, which focuses on following rules that generally promote utility, and preference utilitarianism, which considers the satisfaction of preferences rather than just pleasure. Deontology. Deontology is an ethical theory that judges the morality of actions based on adherence to rules, duties, and principles rather than consequences. Developed most famously by philosopher Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, deontological ethics emphasizes that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of their outcomes. This approach contrasts sharply with consequentialist theories like utilitarianism, which focus solely on results. Kant's categorical imperative serves as the foundation of deontological thinking, proposing that moral actions must be universalizable and treat humanity always as an end, never merely as a means. For example, lying is wrong not because it produces bad consequences, but because it violates the fundamental duty to respect others' rational autonomy and cannot be universally applied without contradiction. Deontological ethics provides clear moral guidelines and protects individual rights by establishing inviolable duties. It suggests that some actions, such as murder or breaking promises, are absolutely prohibited regardless of potential benefits. Critics argue that rigid adherence to rules can lead to counterintuitive or harmful outcomes, and that the theory struggles with conflicting duties. Despite these challenges, deontology remains influential in legal systems, professional ethics, and human rights frameworks. Existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophical movement that emphasizes individual existence, freedom, and the responsibility to create meaning in life. This philosophy emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries through thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir. Existentialists argue that existence precedes essence, meaning humans exist first and then define themselves through their choices and actions, rather than being born with predetermined purposes or natures. Central to existentialist thought is the concept of radical freedom and the anxiety that accompanies it. Humans are thrown into existence without choosing to be born, yet they must take full responsibility for their decisions and their consequences. This freedom can be overwhelming, leading to what Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom and what Sartre described as being condemned to be free. Existentialism emphasizes authenticity, encouraging individuals to live according to their own values rather than conforming to external expectations or societal norms. The philosophy acknowledges that life can seem absurd or meaningless, but argues that this absence of predetermined meaning creates the opportunity for genuine self-creation. Existentialists reject the idea that human nature is fixed, instead proposing that individuals continuously create themselves through their choices. Absurdism. Absurdism is a philosophical position that confronts the fundamental conflict between human desire for meaning and the universe's apparent meaninglessness. Developed primarily by Albert Camus in the mid-20th century, absurdism acknowledges that humans naturally seek purpose, explanation, and rational order in life, yet the universe remains silent and indifferent to these needs. This collision creates what Camus termed the absurd. Unlike nihilism, which concludes that life's meaninglessness renders existence pointless, absurdism advocates for a defiant embrace of life despite its absurdity. Camus argued that recognizing the absurd condition should not lead to despair or suicide, but rather to a passionate engagement with existence. He used the myth of Sisyphus, condemned to eternally push a boulder up a mountain, as a metaphor for the human condition. Absurdism proposes three responses to absurdity: suicide, philosophical suicide through faith or ideology, or acceptance and rebellion. The absurd hero chooses the third path, living fully while acknowledging life's fundamental meaninglessness. This rebellion involves creating personal values and finding joy in the struggle itself, rather than seeking external validation or transcendent purpose. Camus famously concluded that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, suggesting that authentic living comes from embracing rather than escaping the absurd. Determinism. Determinism is the philosophical doctrine that all events, including human actions and decisions, are the inevitable result of prior causes operating according to natural laws. This worldview suggests that everything that happens in the universe is predetermined by the chain of cause and effect that stretches back to the beginning of time. According to determinism, given the state of the universe at any moment, there is exactly one physically possible future. The concept gained prominence during the scientific revolution when thinkers like Pierre-Simon Laplace proposed that if someone knew the position and momentum of every particle in the universe, they could predict the entire future and retroduce the past. This mechanistic view treats the universe as a vast machine where every event follows necessarily from previous conditions. Determinism raises profound questions about human responsibility and moral accountability. If our actions are predetermined by prior causes, can we be truly responsible for our choices? Various forms of determinism exist, including hard determinism, which denies free will entirely, and soft determinism or compatibilism, which attempts to reconcile determinism with moral responsibility. Religious determinism suggests divine predestination, while biological determinism emphasizes genetic and environmental factors. Modern quantum mechanics has introduced probabilistic elements that challenge strict determinism, though debate continues about whether quantum indeterminacy truly affects human behavior. Free will. Free will is the philosophical concept that humans possess the genuine ability to make choices that are not entirely determined by prior causes, natural laws, or divine decree. This capacity suggests that individuals can act as the ultimate source of their decisions, bearing true moral responsibility for their actions. Free will implies that when faced with multiple options, people can genuinely choose between them, and their choice is not merely the inevitable result of preceding events. The debate over free will has persisted for millennia, intersecting with questions about moral responsibility, punishment, and human dignity. Libertarians argue that free will is incompatible with determinism and that humans possess genuine agency. Hard determinists reject free will entirely, claiming that all actions are the result of prior causes. Compatibilists attempt to reconcile free will with determinism, arguing that freedom means acting according to one's own desires without external coercion, even if those desires are themselves determined. Modern neuroscience has complicated this debate by revealing that brain activity associated with decisions often occurs before conscious awareness of choosing. Some philosophers argue that free will is an illusion, while others maintain that our subjective experience of choice remains meaningful regardless of underlying neural mechanisms. The question remains central to ethics, law, and personal identity. Solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophical position that only one's own mind is sure to exist, and that knowledge of anything outside one's own mind is uncertain or impossible. This extreme form of skepticism suggests that the external world, including other people, may be mere figments of one's imagination or mental constructs rather than independently existing realities. The term derives from the Latin solus ipse, meaning self alone. The solipsistic argument often begins with the observation that we can only directly experience our own consciousness and mental states. Everything else, including the apparent existence of other minds and the physical world, must be inferred from these subjective experiences. Since such inferences could be mistaken, the solipsist argues that we cannot be certain of anything beyond our own immediate experience. While few philosophers seriously adopt solipsism as a complete worldview, it serves as an important thought experiment that highlights fundamental epistemological problems. It demonstrates the difficulty of proving the existence of an external world and other minds based solely on subjective experience. The position is generally considered philosophically interesting but practically untenable, as it leads to a form of radical isolation that contradicts our everyday experience of meaningful interaction with others and the world. Dualism. Dualism is the philosophical doctrine that reality consists of two fundamental and distinct types of substance or property, mind and matter, or mental and physical. The most famous version is Cartesian dualism, developed by René Descartes in the 17th century, which posits that the mind is a non-physical, thinking substance that exists separately from the physical body. According to this view, mental phenomena like thoughts, emotions, and consciousness cannot be reduced to or explained entirely by physical processes. Descartes argued that the mind and body interact despite their different natures, though he struggled to explain how this interaction occurs. This created what philosophers call the interaction problem. How can something non-physical influence something physical? Property dualism offers a modified approach, suggesting that while there is only one kind of substance, it has both mental and physical properties that cannot be reduced to each other. Dualism addresses the intuitive feeling that consciousness seems fundamentally different from physical matter. It attempts to preserve the unique nature of subjective experience, free will, and personal identity. Critics argue that dualism conflicts with scientific understanding of the brain's role in mental processes and creates unnecessary metaphysical complications. The mind-body problem remains one of philosophy's most enduring challenges. Monism. Monism is the philosophical view that reality consists of only one fundamental substance or type of being, in contrast to dualism, which posits two separate realms. This position argues that all existence can be reduced to a single, unified principle or substance. Monism takes several forms, each proposing different candidates for this fundamental reality. Materialism or physicalism represents one major form of monism, claiming that everything, including consciousness and mental states, is ultimately physical or can be explained by physical processes. According to this view, thoughts and emotions are simply complex arrangements of matter and energy, particularly brain activity. Idealism presents the opposite approach, suggesting that reality is fundamentally mental or spiritual, with the physical world being a manifestation of mind or consciousness. Neutral monism proposes that both mental and physical phenomena arise from a more basic, neutral substance that is neither inherently mental nor physical. Spinoza's substance monism argued for a single substance that is both mental and physical attributes, viewing mind and body as two aspects of the same underlying reality. Monism appeals to those seeking theoretical simplicity and unity in explaining existence. It avoids the interaction problems that plague dualism while providing a comprehensive worldview. However, critics argue that monism struggles to adequately account for the apparent fundamental differences between mental and physical phenomena. Empiricism. Empiricism is the philosophical theory that knowledge comes primarily or exclusively from sensory experience and observation rather than from innate ideas or pure reason. This epistemological position holds that we learn about the world through our senses, sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, and that these experiences form the foundation of all genuine knowledge. Empiricists argue that the mind begins as a blank slate or tabula rasa, which is then filled with information gathered through experience. John Locke, a prominent 17th-century empiricist, argued that all ideas derive from sensation and reflection on sensory experiences. David Hume further developed empiricism by emphasizing that even our understanding of causation comes from observing repeated patterns in experience rather than logical necessity. George Berkeley took empiricism to its extreme, arguing that material objects exist only as collections of sensory ideas perceived by minds. Empiricism has profoundly influenced scientific methodology, emphasizing the importance of experimentation, observation, and evidence-based reasoning. It supports the idea that theories must be tested against empirical data to be considered valid. Critics argue that empiricism cannot account for mathematical truths, logical principles, or the conceptual frameworks necessary to organize and interpret sensory data. The debate between empiricism and rationalism continues to shape discussions about the nature and limits of human knowledge. Rationalism. Rationalism is the philosophical doctrine that reason and logical thinking, rather than sensory experience, are the primary sources of knowledge and truth. Rationalists argue that the mind possesses innate ideas or the capacity to discover fundamental truths through pure thought and deductive reasoning. This epistemological position holds that certain knowledge can be attained independently of empirical observation, and that reason is more reliable than the senses for understanding reality. René Descartes, often considered the father of modern rationalism, demonstrated this approach through his method of systematic doubt, ultimately arriving at cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, as an indubitable foundation for knowledge. Gottfried Leibniz and Baruch Spinoza further developed rationalist philosophy, emphasizing the power of logical analysis and mathematical reasoning to reveal universal truths about existence, morality, and the nature of reality. Rationalists typically argue that mathematical and logical truths are known a priori, meaning they can be understood without empirical verification. They contend that reason can discover necessary truths about the world that sensory experience cannot provide. Critics argue that rationalism overestimates the power of pure thought and neglects the importance of empirical evidence. The tension between rationalism and empiricism has driven much philosophical inquiry about the sources and limits of human knowledge. Relativism. Relativism is the philosophical position that truth, morality, or knowledge are not absolute but are relative to particular frameworks, cultures, historical periods, or individual perspectives. This view argues that there are no universal or objective standards by which to judge beliefs, values, or practices across different contexts. What is considered true or morally right in one culture may be false or wrong in another, and neither can claim superiority over the other. Cultural relativism, developed by anthropologists like Franz Boas, suggests that moral and social practices should be understood within their specific cultural contexts rather than judged by external standards. Epistemological relativism extends this to knowledge claims, arguing that what counts as evidence or rational justification varies across different conceptual schemes or paradigms. Moral relativism holds that ethical judgments are valid only within particular cultural or individual frameworks. Relativism challenges ethnocentric assumptions and promotes tolerance by recognizing the diversity of human values and ways of life. It has influenced fields like anthropology, sociology, and postmodern philosophy. Critics argue that relativism leads to contradictions, as the claim that all truth is relative seems to make an absolute statement. They also contend that relativism undermines the possibility of moral criticism and social progress by making all positions equally valid. Moral absolutism. Moral absolutism is the ethical position that certain moral principles are universally valid and binding regardless of context, culture, or circumstances. This view holds that some actions are inherently right or wrong, independent of their consequences, cultural background, or individual beliefs. Moral absolutists argue that objective moral truths exist and can be discovered through reason, divine revelation, or natural law, providing unchanging standards for ethical behavior across all times and places. Religious traditions often embrace moral absolutism, with commandments like "thou shalt not kill" or "thou shalt not steal" serving as universal prohibitions. Philosophical versions include natural law theory, which argues that moral principles are built into the fabric of reality, and Kantian deontology, which proposes that certain duties are categorically binding. Absolutists contend that without universal moral standards, ethical discourse becomes meaningless and moral progress impossible. Moral absolutism provides clear guidance for ethical decision-making and supports the idea of universal human rights. It offers a foundation for critiquing harmful practices regardless of their cultural acceptance. Critics argue that absolutism is rigid and fails to account for moral complexity, conflicting duties, and cultural diversity. They suggest that absolute rules may lead to counterintuitive conclusions and that moral principles should be flexible enough to accommodate different contexts and competing values. Virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a moral philosophy that focuses on character traits and what kind of person one should be, rather than on specific actions or consequences. This approach, tracing back to Aristotle, emphasizes the cultivation of virtues such as courage, honesty, compassion, justice, and wisdom as the foundation of ethical living. Virtue ethicists argue that moral behavior flows naturally from having a virtuous character, and that the goal of ethics is human flourishing or eudaimonia. Aristotle identified virtues as the mean between extremes of excess and deficiency. For example, courage is the virtue that lies between cowardice and recklessness. He distinguished between intellectual virtues, acquired through teaching, and moral virtues, developed through practice and habituation. The virtuous person acts from stable dispositions that have been cultivated over time through repeated good choices. Modern virtue ethics, revived by philosophers like Alistair MacIntyre and Philippa Foot, emphasizes the importance of moral education and the social context in which virtues are developed. This approach recognizes that virtues may vary across cultures while maintaining that character excellence remains universally important. Critics argue that virtue ethics provides insufficient guidance for specific moral decisions and that determining which character traits count as virtues depends on controversial assumptions about human nature and flourishing. Consequentialism. Consequentialism is the ethical theory that judges the rightness or wrongness of actions solely based on their outcomes or consequences. This approach argues that the moral value of an action depends entirely on whether it produces good or bad results, regardless of the action's intrinsic nature or the agent's intentions. Consequentialists focus on maximizing good consequences and minimizing harmful ones when making ethical decisions. Utilitarianism represents the most well-known form of consequentialism, advocating for actions that produce the greatest overall happiness or well-being for the greatest number of people. Other variants include rule consequentialism, which evaluates moral rules based on their consequences, and egoistic consequentialism, which focuses on maximizing good outcomes for the individual agent. Some consequentialists define good outcomes in terms of pleasure, preference satisfaction, or objective values like knowledge and friendship. Consequentialism appeals to practical reasoning and provides a clear method for moral decision-making by focusing on measurable results. It supports utilitarian calculations in public policy and appears to align with common-sense moral thinking in many situations. Critics argue that consequentialism can justify intuitively wrong actions if they produce better overall outcomes, potentially sacrificing individual rights for collective benefit. The theory also faces challenges in measuring and comparing different types of consequences across different people and situations. Categorical Imperative. The categorical imperative is Immanuel Kant's fundamental principle of moral philosophy, which provides a universal test for determining the rightness of actions. Unlike hypothetical imperatives that depend on personal desires or goals, the categorical imperative is unconditional and applies to all rational beings regardless of their particular wants or circumstances. Kant formulated this principle in several ways, with the most famous being, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This formulation requires individuals to consider whether the principle behind their action could be consistently applied by everyone. For example, lying fails this test because if everyone lied, the concept of truth-telling would become meaningless, creating a logical contradiction. Kant's second formulation states, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This emphasizes respect for human dignity and rational autonomy. The categorical imperative provides a rational foundation for morality that does not depend on consequences, emotions, or cultural practices. It establishes universal moral duties and protects individual rights. Critics argue that Kant's formulations can be too rigid, may conflict with each other, and sometimes produce counterintuitive results when applied to complex moral situations. Social contract. The social contract is a foundational concept in political philosophy that explains how and why societies form governments and establish rules for living together. At its core, the social contract represents an implicit agreement between individuals and their government, where people voluntarily surrender certain freedoms in exchange for protection of their remaining rights and the benefits of organized society. Philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau developed different versions of social contract theory. Hobbes argued that without government, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, so people agree to submit to a sovereign authority to escape this chaotic state of nature. Locke emphasized that the contract should protect natural rights like life, liberty, and property. Rousseau focused on how the contract should reflect the general will of the people. The social contract is not a literal written document but rather a philosophical framework for understanding the relationship between citizens and their government. It suggests that governmental authority derives from the consent of the governed, and that if a government fails to uphold its end of the agreement, citizens have the right to alter or abolish it. This concept heavily influenced democratic revolutions and modern constitutional governments. Tabula Rasa. Tabula rasa, meaning blank slate in Latin, is a philosophical concept that suggests human beings are born without built-in mental content and that all knowledge comes from experience and perception. This theory was most famously championed by English philosopher John Locke in the 17th century, though the idea has ancient roots dating back to Aristotle. According to tabula rasa theory, at birth, the human mind is like a clean slate or empty tablet, completely devoid of ideas, knowledge, or preconceptions. Everything we know, believe, and understand is acquired through our senses and experiences throughout life. This stands in direct opposition to the concept of innate ideas, which suggests that certain knowledge or moral principles are hardwired into human nature from birth. The implications of tabula rasa are profound for education, psychology, and social policy. If humans are indeed blank slates, then environment, education, and social conditions play crucial roles in shaping who we become. This theory supports the idea that people can be fundamentally changed through proper education and social reform. It also raises questions about personal responsibility and the nature versus nurture debate that continues to influence modern psychology and neuroscience. Natural rights. Natural rights are fundamental human rights that philosophers argue exist independently of government, law, or social convention. These rights are considered inherent to human nature itself, meaning every person possesses them simply by virtue of being human. The concept suggests that these rights are universal, inalienable, and exist in what philosophers call the state of nature before any organized society is formed. John Locke, one of the most influential natural rights theorists, identified three primary natural rights: life, liberty, and property. He argued that these rights are self-evident and that the primary purpose of government is to protect them. Other philosophers have expanded this list to include rights such as freedom of speech, religion, and the pursuit of happiness. The theory of natural rights has been enormously influential in shaping modern democratic societies and legal systems. It provided the philosophical foundation for documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. The concept implies that certain rights cannot be legitimately taken away by governments because they precede and transcend political authority. This creates a moral framework for evaluating laws and governmental actions, suggesting that any law or government that violates natural rights lacks legitimacy and moral authority. The Allegory of the Cave. The Allegory of the Cave is one of the most famous philosophical illustrations, created by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato in his work The Republic. This powerful metaphor describes prisoners chained in a dark cave since birth, facing a wall where they can only see shadows cast by objects behind them. To these prisoners, the shadows represent reality because they have never experienced anything else. The allegory unfolds when one prisoner breaks free and discovers the true source of the shadows, a fire casting light on real objects. Eventually, he escapes the cave entirely and sees the sun, representing ultimate truth and knowledge. When he returns to tell the other prisoners about reality, they reject his revelations and even become hostile toward him. Plato uses this story to illustrate the philosopher's journey from ignorance to knowledge and the difficulty of achieving true understanding. The cave represents the world of appearances and illusions that most people mistake for reality. The journey upward symbolizes the philosophical process of education and enlightenment, moving from mere opinion to genuine knowledge. The allegory also highlights the challenges faced by those who attempt to enlighten others, as people often resist having their fundamental beliefs challenged, preferring familiar illusions to uncomfortable truths. The Veil of Ignorance. The Veil of Ignorance is a thought experiment developed by philosopher John Rawls in his influential work A Theory of Justice published in 1971. This concept asks us to imagine designing a fair society from behind a hypothetical veil that prevents us from knowing our own position within that society. Behind this veil, we would not know our race, gender, social class, talents, disabilities, or any other personal characteristics that might influence our preferences. Rawls argued that this original position of ignorance would lead rational people to choose principles of justice that are truly fair and impartial. Since we could end up in any position within the society we design, we would naturally create rules that protect the most vulnerable members and ensure equal basic liberties for all. This would lead to what Rawls called justice as fairness. The veil of ignorance serves as a powerful tool for moral reasoning about social justice and public policy. It helps us move beyond our personal biases and self-interest to consider what arrangements would be fair for everyone. For example, when designing healthcare systems, tax policies, or educational opportunities, the veil of ignorance encourages us to think about what we would choose if we did not know whether we would be rich or poor, healthy or sick, talented or struggling. The problem of evil. The problem of evil is one of the most challenging questions in philosophy of religion and theology. It asks how an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God can allow evil and suffering to exist in the world. This philosophical dilemma creates what appears to be a logical contradiction. If God has the power to prevent evil, knows about all evil, and is perfectly good, then evil should not exist. Yet we observe tremendous suffering, cruelty, and injustice throughout human history and the natural world. Philosophers have proposed various responses to this problem. Some argue that evil is necessary for free will to exist, as humans must have the genuine option to choose wrongly. Others suggest that suffering serves a greater purpose in developing character, or that what we perceive as evil serves some ultimate good we cannot understand. The evidential version of the problem argues that while some evil might be justified, the sheer quantity and intensity of suffering in the world makes God's existence highly improbable. This problem has profound implications for religious belief and continues to challenge believers and philosophers alike in their understanding of divine nature and human existence. The mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is a fundamental question in philosophy of mind that asks how mental states relate to physical states. This problem arises from the apparent differences between our subjective, conscious experiences and the objective, physical processes of the brain. When you feel pain, experience joy, Or think about mathematics, something mental is happening, but neuroscience shows us that these experiences correlate with specific brain activity. The puzzle is understanding exactly how these two seemingly different realms connect. Several theories attempt to solve this problem. Dualism, famously defended by René Descartes, argues that mind and body are separate substances that somehow interact. Materialism or physicalism claims that mental states are nothing more than brain states or physical processes. Functionalism suggests that mental states are defined by their functional roles rather than their physical composition. Each approach faces significant challenges in explaining how consciousness emerges from or relates to physical matter. This problem has profound implications for understanding human nature, personal identity, and free will. If our minds are purely physical, what does this mean for concepts like moral responsibility? The mind-body problem remains one of the most active areas of philosophical inquiry, with new developments in neuroscience and cognitive science continually informing the debate. Cartesian Skepticism. Cartesian skepticism is a philosophical method developed by René Descartes in the 17th century that involves systematically doubting everything that can possibly be doubted in order to find certain, indubitable knowledge. Descartes employed this radical skepticism as a tool to establish a secure foundation for knowledge, not to promote permanent doubt. He imagined scenarios such as an evil demon deceiving him about everything he believes, or the possibility that all his experiences might be illusions. Through this process of methodical doubt, Descartes discovered that even if he doubted everything, he could not doubt that he was doubting, and therefore thinking. This led to his famous conclusion "I think, therefore I am," or cogito ergo sum in Latin. This became his first certainty, the foundation upon which he rebuilt knowledge about God, the external world, and mathematics. Cartesian skepticism raises profound questions about the nature of knowledge and reality that continue to influence philosophy today. It highlights the gap between our subjective experiences and objective reality, challenging us to consider what we can truly know with certainty. Modern variations of these skeptical scenarios, such as the possibility that we might be brains in vats or living in a computer simulation, demonstrate the lasting relevance of Cartesian doubt. Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a principle of reasoning that suggests the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Named after 14th-century English philosopher William of Occam, this principle states that when faced with multiple competing hypotheses that make the same predictions, one should select the solution with the fewest assumptions. It is often summarized as entities should not be multiplied without necessity, or more simply, the simplest explanation is the best. This principle does not claim that simple explanations are always true, but rather that they are more likely to be correct and should be preferred when other factors are equal. In scientific inquiry, Occam's razor helps researchers avoid unnecessarily complex theories when simpler ones can adequately explain the observed phenomena. For example, if you hear hoofbeats, it is more reasonable to think of horses rather than zebras, assuming you live in a place where horses are common. Occam's razor serves as a practical tool for decision-making and problem-solving across various fields, from science to everyday life. It encourages intellectual humility and efficiency by discouraging the multiplication of hypotheses without sufficient evidence. However, critics argue that nature is not always simple, and sometimes more complex explanations are indeed correct, making this principle a useful guideline rather than an absolute rule. Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is a philosophical argument for belief in God created by 17th-century French mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal. Rather than attempting to prove God's existence through traditional logical arguments, Pascal approached the question as a matter of practical decision-making under uncertainty. He argued that since we cannot know with certainty whether God exists, we should consider the potential consequences of our choice to believe or not believe. Pascal structured this as a wager with 4 possible outcomes. If you believe in God and God exists, you gain infinite reward in eternal life. If you believe in God and God does not exist, you lose relatively little. If you do not believe in God and God does not exist, you gain little. However, if you do not believe in God and God does exist, you face infinite punishment. Given these possibilities, Pascal argued that the rational choice is to believe in God because the potential infinite gain outweighs any finite loss. Critics of Pascal's wager point out several problems with this reasoning. It assumes a specific conception of God and afterlife, ignores the possibility of multiple competing religions, and questions whether genuine belief can be chosen pragmatically. Nevertheless, the wager remains influential as an example of decision theory applied to religious questions. The Euthyphro Dilemma. The Euthyphro Dilemma is a philosophical problem that questions the relationship between morality and divine command, first presented by Plato in his dialogue Euthyphro. The dilemma poses a fundamental question: is something morally good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is morally good? This creates a troubling fork for those who believe that morality depends on God's will. If we accept that things are good simply because God commands them, then morality becomes arbitrary. God could theoretically command cruelty or hatred, and these would become morally good by definition. This makes moral goodness dependent on divine whim rather than any inherent quality. On the other hand, if we say that God commands things because they are already good, then goodness exists independently of God, which seems to limit God's sovereignty and suggests that moral truths exist outside of divine authority. This dilemma has profound implications for religious ethics and moral philosophy. It challenges the foundation of divine command theory and forces us to consider whether moral truths are discovered or created. The dilemma continues to influence debates about the source of moral authority and the relationship between religion and ethics in contemporary philosophy. The is-ought problem. The is-ought problem is a philosophical challenge identified by David Hume in the 18th century that questions how we can derive moral conclusions from factual premises. Hume observed that there seems to be a logical gap between descriptive statements about how the world is and prescriptive statements about how it ought to be. This problem highlights the difficulty of moving from objective facts to moral judgments without making additional assumptions. For example, we might observe that people suffer when they are hungry, which is a factual statement about the world. However, concluding that we ought to feed hungry people requires an additional moral premise that suffering should be prevented or that we have obligations to help others. Hume argued that this jump from is to ought cannot be made through reason alone, as moral conclusions do not logically follow from purely factual premises. This problem has significant implications for moral philosophy and ethics. It suggests that moral knowledge might be fundamentally different from empirical knowledge and challenges attempts to ground ethics in natural facts or scientific observations. The is-ought problem continues to influence debates about moral epistemology, the relationship between science and ethics, and whether objective moral truths can be discovered through empirical investigation. Hume's fork. Hume's fork is a fundamental distinction in epistemology created by David Hume that divides all meaningful propositions into two categories: relations of ideas and matters of fact. This fork represents Hume's argument that these are the only two types of genuine knowledge, and anything that falls outside these categories should be considered meaningless or at least unknowable through reason. Relations of ideas include mathematical truths, logical statements, and definitions that are true by virtue of their logical structure alone. These propositions are necessarily true and can be known a priori, meaning without reference to experience. For example, all bachelors are unmarried men is true by definition. Matters of fact, on the other hand, concern empirical claims about the world that must be verified through experience and observation. These are contingent truths that could potentially be false, such as the sun will rise tomorrow. Hume's fork has profound implications for metaphysics and theology. It suggests that traditional metaphysical questions about the nature of reality, God's existence, or absolute moral truths cannot be answered through pure reason alone. This skeptical challenge influenced later philosophers and contributed to the development of logical positivism. The fork continues to shape debates about the limits of human knowledge and the relationship between reason and experience. The Gettier Problem. The Gettier Problem is a challenge to the traditional definition of knowledge that was presented by philosopher Edmund Gettier in 1963. For centuries, philosophers had generally accepted that knowledge could be defined as justified true belief, meaning that to know something, you must believe it, it must be true, and you must have good reasons for believing it. Gettier demonstrated that this definition is insufficient by presenting cases where someone has a justified true belief that we would not intuitively consider knowledge. In Gettier's famous examples, a person arrives at a true belief through reasoning that appears justified but is actually based on false premises or lucky coincidences. For instance, imagine someone looks at a clock that has stopped exactly 12 hours ago, and it happens to show the correct time. They form a justified true belief about the current time, but we would not say they truly know what time it is because their belief was only accidentally correct. These cases reveal that knowledge requires more than just justified true belief. The problem has sparked decades of philosophical debate about what additional condition is needed for knowledge. Some philosophers propose that knowledge requires the absence of luck, while others suggest that beliefs must be formed through reliable processes or that justification must be undefeated by false information. The paradox of the heap, Sorites paradox. The paradox of the heap, also known as the Sorites paradox, is a logical puzzle that demonstrates the problems arising from vague concepts and language. The paradox begins with the seemingly obvious premise that a million grains of sand make a heap. It then asks, if we remove one grain of sand, do we still have a heap? Most would answer yes, since one grain should not make the difference between a heap and a non-heap. However, if we continue this reasoning and remove grains one by one, we eventually reach a point where we have only one grain of sand remaining. But surely one grain cannot constitute a heap. This creates a paradox because our step-by-step reasoning suggests that we never stopped having a heap, yet we intuitively know that one grain is not a heap. The same paradox applies to many everyday concepts like tall, bald, rich, or old. This paradox highlights the fundamental problem of vagueness in language and concepts. It challenges our understanding of how language relates to reality and raises questions about whether precise boundaries exist for seemingly clear concepts. The Sorites paradox has important implications for logic, linguistics, and philosophy of language, showing how our ordinary ways of reasoning can lead to contradictions when applied to vague terms. The problem of induction. The problem of induction is a fundamental challenge to our ability to make reliable predictions about the future based on past experience. This problem, most famously articulated by David Hume, questions whether we can logically justify our belief that patterns observed in the past will continue into the future. Every day we rely on inductive reasoning when we expect the sun to rise tomorrow, assume that water will boil at the same temperature, or believe that gravity will continue to work as it always has. The problem arises because inductive reasoning cannot be justified through logic alone. We cannot prove that the future will resemble the past without already assuming that inductive reasoning works, which creates a circular argument. Even if something has happened consistently throughout history, there is no logical guarantee it will continue. Hume argued that our reliance on induction is based on habit and psychological conditioning rather than rational justification. This problem has profound implications for science, which depends heavily on inductive methods to form theories and make predictions. It challenges our confidence in scientific laws and raises questions about the nature of knowledge itself. While we continue to use inductive reasoning successfully in practice, the problem highlights the gap between logical certainty and practical necessity. The Ontological Argument. The ontological argument is a philosophical proof for God's existence that attempts to demonstrate that God must exist based purely on the concept or definition of God, without requiring any empirical evidence. The most famous version was developed by Saint Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century, though it has been refined and defended by philosophers like René Descartes and Alvin Plantinga. Anselm's argument begins with the definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. He then argues that if God exists only in our minds as a concept, we could conceive of something greater, a God who exists both in our minds and in reality. Since existence in reality is greater than existence only in thought, and we define God as the greatest conceivable being, God must exist in reality to fulfill this definition. In other words, a God who does not exist would be less perfect than one who does exist. Critics have raised numerous objections to this argument. Immanuel Kant famously argued that existence is not a predicate or property that can make something greater. Others question whether we can define things into existence or whether the argument proves too much by potentially demonstrating the existence of any perfect entity. Despite these criticisms, the ontological argument remains influential in philosophical theology. The Cosmological Argument. The cosmological argument is a philosophical proof for God's existence based on the principle that everything that exists must have a cause. This argument, developed by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and later refined by many others, begins with the observation that things in the universe come into existence and are caused by other things. Since we cannot have an infinite chain of causes stretching back forever, there must be a first cause that is itself uncaused. The argument typically proceeds through several steps. First, it establishes that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Second, it argues that the universe began to exist. Third, it concludes that therefore the universe must have a cause. This cause, the argument maintains, must be outside the natural world, timeless, spaceless, and immensely powerful. These characteristics, proponents argue, match what we traditionally call God. Critics of the cosmological argument raise several objections. Some question whether the principle that everything must have a cause is universally true, especially at the quantum level where events may be genuinely random. Others ask why God should be exempt from needing a cause, or whether an infinite regress of causes is actually impossible. Despite these challenges, the cosmological argument remains one of the most popular and intuitive arguments for God's existence. The teleological argument. The teleological argument, also known as the argument from design, proposes that God's existence can be inferred from the apparent design and order found in the natural world. This argument suggests that the complexity, functionality, and purposefulness observed in living organisms and the universe as a whole are best explained by an intelligent designer rather than random chance or natural processes alone. The argument gained particular prominence through William Paley's famous watchmaker analogy. Paley argued that if someone found a watch in a field, they would naturally conclude it was designed by an intelligent being because of its intricate mechanism and purposeful arrangement of parts. Similarly, the argument claims that biological systems like the eye, with their remarkable complexity and apparent purpose, point to an intelligent creator. Modern versions of the teleological argument often focus on the fine-tuning of physical constants in the universe that seem perfectly calibrated to allow life to exist. Critics, however, point to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution as providing a natural explanation for biological complexity without requiring a designer. They also argue that apparent design might be an illusion created by our tendency to see patterns and purpose where none exist. Despite these objections, the teleological argument continues to influence discussions about the relationship between science and religion. The principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason is a fundamental philosophical principle stating that everything that exists or happens must have a sufficient reason or explanation for why it exists or occurs rather than not. This principle, most famously developed by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in the 17th century, asserts that nothing happens without a reason, even if that reason is not immediately apparent to us. According to this principle, for every fact or event, there must be an explanation that accounts for why things are as they are rather than otherwise. This applies not only to physical events but also to abstract truths in the existence of things themselves. Leibniz distinguished between two types of truths: truths of reason, which are logically necessary, and truths of fact, which are contingent but still require sufficient reason for their existence. The principle has been used to support various philosophical arguments, including proofs for God's existence, since it suggests that the existence of the universe itself requires a sufficient reason. Critics argue that the principle may be too strong, particularly in light of quantum mechanics where some events appear to be genuinely random. Others question whether we can meaningfully apply this principle to existence itself or whether some brute facts might simply have no further explanation. Despite these challenges, the principle remains influential in metaphysics and rational inquiry. Compatibilism. Compatibilism is the philosophical position that free will and determinism can coexist without contradiction. This view attempts to reconcile the apparent conflict between our belief that we make free choices and the scientific understanding that all events, including human actions, are the result of prior causes following natural laws. Compatibilists argue that being free does not require being uncaused, but rather means acting according to our own desires and reasoning without external coercion. According to compatibilist thinking, what matters for free will is not whether our actions are determined, but whether they flow from our own character, values, and decision-making processes. A person acts freely when they do what they want to do, when their actions align with their beliefs and desires, and when they are not forced or manipulated by external factors. The fact that these desires and beliefs were themselves shaped by prior causes does not eliminate freedom. This position allows compatibilists to maintain moral responsibility while accepting scientific determinism. They argue that we can legitimately hold people accountable for their actions because those actions still originate from the person's own mental processes. Critics, however, argue that if everything is determined, including our thoughts and desires, then genuine freedom and responsibility become illusions. Incompatibilism. Incompatibilism is the philosophical position that free will and determinism cannot both be true simultaneously. Incompatibilists argue that if determinism is correct and all events, including human actions, are the inevitable result of prior causes, then genuine free will is impossible. This view maintains that there is a fundamental conflict between the scientific understanding of causation and our ordinary concepts of choice, responsibility, and moral agency. Incompatibilists typically fall into two camps. Hard determinists accept that determinism is true and conclude that free will is an illusion, which means that moral responsibility and punishment are ultimately unjustified. Libertarians, on the other hand, believe that free will exists and therefore reject determinism, arguing that human actions involve genuine choice that cannot be reduced to prior causes. Both groups agree that determinism and free will are mutually exclusive. The incompatibilist position raises profound questions about how we should structure society, law, and ethics. If people are not truly responsible for their actions, traditional notions of praise, blame, and punishment lose their foundation. However, incompatibilists must also explain how free will could work in a world governed by natural laws, or alternatively, how we can maintain meaning and purpose in a deterministic universe where choice is ultimately illusory. Logical positivism. Logical positivism is a philosophical movement that emerged in the early 20th century, primarily associated with the Vienna Circle. It holds that the only meaningful statements are those that can be empirically verified through direct observation or logical proof. According to logical positivists, if a statement cannot be tested or logically deduced, such as metaphysical claims about God, the soul, or the nature of reality, it is considered meaningless. The central idea behind logical positivism is the verification principle. This principle states that a proposition is only cognitively meaningful if it can be verified through sensory experience or is tautologically true, like in mathematics or logic. As a result, many traditional philosophical discussions were dismissed by logical positivists as nonsensical or unscientific. This approach had a major influence on the philosophy of science, encouraging clarity, precision, and the use of formal logic in evaluating claims. However, logical positivism later faced strong criticism, particularly because the verification principle itself cannot be verified by its own standard. This led to its decline, but its emphasis on clarity and empiricism still shapes analytic philosophy today. Ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is the moral theory that individuals ought to act in their own self-interest. According to this view, it is right for people to prioritize their own well-being, goals, and happiness above the interests of others. Ethical egoism does not deny that helping others can be good, but it holds that such actions are only morally right if they ultimately benefit the person performing them. Unlike selfishness, which often implies harming or ignoring others for personal gain, ethical egoism can include cooperation, kindness, or generosity, as long as these behaviors serve the individual's long-term interest. For example, being honest or generous might build trust and improve relationships, which can benefit the individual in the long run. Ethical egoism is different from psychological egoism, which claims that people always act in their own interest as a matter of fact. Ethical egoism is prescriptive, it says people should act that way. Critics argue that this theory undermines moral concern for others and could justify harmful behavior. Supporters, however, claim it encourages self-responsibility and rational decision-making. Altruism. Altruism is the ethical principle or practice of concern for the well-being of others, often placing their needs above one's own. An altruistic person acts out of selfless concern, not because it benefits them, but because they value the happiness or relief of others. Altruism can take many forms, helping a stranger in need, sacrificing time or resources for someone else, or even risking one's life to save another. Philosophers have debated whether true altruism is possible. Some argue that all actions, even generous ones, ultimately serve the self in some indirect way, such as feeling good about helping or gaining social approval. Others maintain that people can and do act with pure intentions, especially when there's no apparent reward or recognition involved. Altruism plays a key role in moral systems and religions around the world, often seen as a virtue essential for social harmony and compassion. It also raises important questions in ethics, Is it better to help others at a cost to yourself? Should we always put others first? These questions continue to shape discussions in both philosophy and psychology. Anarchism. Anarchism is the belief that society should exist without hierarchical authority, especially in the form of government or the state. Anarchists argue that people are capable of organizing themselves voluntarily and cooperatively without being controlled by rulers, laws, or enforced power structures. They see centralized authority as inherently oppressive and believe it often leads to inequality, abuse, and the restriction of human freedom. Anarchism is not about chaos or disorder, as commonly misunderstood. Instead, it proposes a system where people live and work together based on mutual aid, shared responsibility, and direct democracy. Different branches of anarchism offer varying approaches. Some focus on individual freedom, others on community equality, but all share a rejection of coercive power. Critics argue that without formal authority, societies might fall into disarray or conflict. Anarchists respond that most authority creates those very problems, and that trust, cooperation, and accountability can grow stronger when not imposed from above. The heart of anarchism lies in the belief that human beings can live justly and freely by building systems based on voluntary participation rather than force. Stoicism. Stoicism is an ancient Greek philosophy that teaches the importance of inner peace, self-control, and rational thinking. Founded by Zeno of Citium, Stoicism emphasizes that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can control how we respond. The core idea is that we should focus only on what is within our power, our thoughts, actions, and attitudes, and accept everything else with calm acceptance. Stoics believe that external events, like wealth, fame, or misfortune, are neither good nor bad in themselves. What truly matters is how we use our reason and live in accordance with virtue, qualities like wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline. For a Stoic, suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our judgments about them. This philosophy encourages resilience and emotional strength. Rather than being ruled by desire or fear, a Stoic seeks tranquility through understanding and accepting the nature of the world. In modern life, Stoicism continues to inspire people to face challenges with clarity and to live with purpose and integrity, regardless of circumstances. Cynicism. Cynicism is a philosophical outlook that originated in ancient Greece, notably through the teachings of Diogenes of Sinope. It promotes living in harmony with nature and rejecting materialism, social status, and artificial conventions. Cynics believe that society's norms, such as wealth, power, and fame, are not only unnecessary but corrupting. They valued simplicity, self-sufficiency, and honesty, often expressed in bold, provocative ways. To a cynic, virtue is the only true good, and it can be achieved through personal integrity and independence from external needs. This meant shedding all that is not essential to a natural and virtuous life. Diogenes, for example, lived in a barrel and famously rejected luxury and comfort, showing through extreme actions that happiness comes not from possessions but from freedom. Modern use of the term cynical often refers to distrust or negativity, but philosophical cynicism is deeper. It's not about bitterness but about a radical commitment to truth and authenticity, even if that means opposing social norms or exposing hypocrisy. Skepticism. Skepticism is the philosophical approach that involves doubting or questioning the validity of certain knowledge, beliefs, or truths. At its core, skepticism encourages critical thinking and warns against accepting claims without sufficient evidence or logical reasoning. It doesn't necessarily mean rejecting all beliefs, but rather approaching them with caution and a demand for justification. Ancient Greek skeptics, like Pyrrho and later Sextus Empiricus, argued that we can never have absolute certainty. Because our senses can deceive us and reasoning can be flawed, they believed the wise person suspends judgment, achieving peace of mind by avoiding dogmatism. In this form, skepticism wasn't about despair but about freedom from anxiety over unknowable truths. In modern philosophy, skepticism plays an essential role in testing ideas. It's foundational in science and epistemology, helping to refine what we accept as knowledge. While extreme skepticism might question whether we can know anything at all, more moderate forms focus on being intellectually honest, curious, and cautious before drawing conclusions. Empathy versus sympathy. Empathy and sympathy are related but distinct emotional responses to the feelings of others. Empathy is the ability to understand and feel what another person is experiencing. It's as if you momentarily step into their shoes and sense their emotions from their point of view. When you're empathetic, you connect with someone's joy, pain, or fear by imagining what it's like to be them. Sympathy, on the other hand, is feeling for someone rather than with them. It's a more distant response, where you acknowledge another person's suffering or emotions, but you don't necessarily feel it yourself. You might feel pity or concern, and you may offer comfort, but you remain emotionally separate. Both empathy and sympathy can lead to kind actions, but empathy is often more powerful in building deep understanding and connection. While sympathy can risk feeling condescending if it lacks true understanding, empathy fosters compassion that comes from shared emotional ground. Recognizing the difference helps us respond more thoughtfully to the struggles of others. The brain in a vat. The brain in a vat is a philosophical thought experiment that challenges our understanding of reality and knowledge. It imagines a scenario where a human brain is removed from its body, placed in a vat of life-sustaining liquid, and connected to a supercomputer. This computer sends electrical signals to the brain that perfectly mimic the experiences the brain would have in the real world. From the brain's point of view, everything would feel normal. It would think it's walking, eating, talking, but in truth, it's just a brain floating in a tank. This scenario raises deep questions about how we know anything at all. If we can't be sure our experiences come from the real world and not from some simulation, how can we trust our senses? It echoes older ideas, like Descartes' evil demon, or more modern versions such as the Matrix. The brain in a vat challenges us to consider whether reality is something we can ever fully access or verify, or whether we're always relying on a possibly flawed perception of it. The experience machine. The experience machine is a philosophical thought experiment proposed by Robert Nozick. It asks us to imagine a machine that can simulate any experience we desire. By connecting to this machine, a person could live out a perfect life full of pleasure, success, or love, all generated by the machine. While hooked up, they wouldn't know it's a simulation. Everything would feel real. The question is simple but powerful: if given the chance, would you plug into the machine for life? Most people hesitate. Nozick uses this reaction to argue that we value more than just pleasure or happiness. He suggests that we care about actually doing things, being a certain kind of person, and living in contact with reality, not just feeling like we are. The experience machine challenges the idea that pleasure is the highest good, which is central to hedonism. This thought experiment pushes us to reflect on what truly matters in life. Is it enough to feel happy, or do we need our happiness to be rooted in something real? The machine tempts us with bliss, but for many, it also highlights the importance of authenticity, growth, and truth. Eternal recurrence. Eternal recurrence is a concept famously explored by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. It is the idea that the universe and all events within it are recurring in an infinite loop, repeating exactly as they did before, over and over for eternity. According to this idea, every joy, every sorrow, every decision you make will happen again, exactly the same way, an infinite number of times. Nietzsche didn't present this idea merely as a scientific theory, but as a profound moral and existential test. He asked, if you knew your life would repeat forever, exactly as it is, would you embrace it or dread it? This question forces us to evaluate how we live. Are we living a life we would be proud to relive infinitely, or are we avoiding our potential and purpose? Eternal recurrence isn't about predicting the future, it's about how we face the present. Nietzsche believed that only those who love life completely, with all its pain and beauty, could say yes to the eternal return. It is a challenge to live with passion, authenticity, and full acceptance of one's choices. The will to power. The will to power is a central concept in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. It refers to a fundamental drive within all living beings, not just to survive, but to assert, grow, and express their strength, creativity, and influence. Nietzsche believed that life is not just a struggle for existence or comfort, but a striving to expand one's power and achieve mastery over one's environment and self. This idea goes beyond physical domination. The will to power is about overcoming obstacles, pushing boundaries, and shaping one's own identity and values. For Nietzsche, this inner drive is at the root of ambition, innovation, and even morality. He saw it in great artists, thinkers, and leaders who don't simply follow tradition but create new paths and challenge existing norms. Nietzsche also used this concept to criticize traditional moral systems, which he believed were designed to suppress the strong and elevate the weak. Instead of denying one's desires and strength, he encouraged individuals to embrace them with courage and creativity. The will to power is not about cruelty, but about the bold affirmation of life and the desire to become more than what one is. The Overman, Übermensch. The Overman, or Übermensch, is one of Friedrich Nietzsche's most famous and challenging ideas. It represents an ideal human who rises above conventional values, transcends herd mentality, and creates their own meaning in a world without inherent purpose. The Overman is not a ruler over others, but someone who has mastered themselves and lives creatively, freely, and courageously. Nietzsche introduced the Overman and thus spoke Zarathustra as the next step in human evolution, not biologically, but spiritually and morally. In a world where God is dead and traditional beliefs are losing their power, Nietzsche believed humanity must redefine what it means to live a meaningful life. The Overman does this by crafting personal values, facing suffering without despair, and embracing life fully, including its hardships. The Overman lives with intensity, responsibility, and joy. He is a creator of purpose, not a follower of outdated rules. Nietzsche saw this figure as rare and difficult to achieve, but essential for the future of humanity. The Overman inspires us to live with authenticity and to become what we truly are. Bad faith, mauvaise foi. Bad faith, or mauvaise foi, is a concept developed by the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. It describes the act of lying to oneself, often in order to escape responsibility or to avoid facing uncomfortable truths about one's freedom. In Sartre's view, human beings are fundamentally free. We are not fixed by any essence or role, and we constantly create ourselves through our choices. However, this freedom can be overwhelming, leading people to deny it by pretending they have no choice or by hiding behind social roles. For example, someone might say, "I have to go to this job, I have no choice," when in truth, they are choosing to go to avoid consequences. Or a person might fully identify with a role, like a waiter who acts as if they are the role rather than a person freely playing it. This is living in bad faith, denying one's own agency. Sartre believed bad faith is a form of self-deception, but not a lie in the usual sense. It is a split within the self, where we try to convince ourselves of something we know isn't entirely true. Facing this, and living honestly, is key to living authentically. Authenticity. Authenticity is a central idea in existentialist philosophy, especially in the works of thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Martin Heidegger. To live authentically means to live in accordance with one's true self, values, and freedom, rather than conforming to social expectations, roles, or false identities. It is about being honest with yourself about who you are, taking responsibility for your choices, and creating meaning in your life based on your own understanding, not what others tell you to be. Authenticity begins with the recognition that we are free. No one else can define our purpose or identity unless we let them. However, this freedom comes with anxiety because it also means we are responsible for shaping our own lives. Many people escape this burden by hiding behind habits, traditions, or societal roles, what Heidegger called falling into the they. An authentic person resists this temptation. They act not because they're expected to, but because they have chosen to, fully aware of the meaning behind their actions. Living authentically doesn't mean rejecting all social norms, but rather engaging with them deliberately. It requires courage, reflection, and the willingness to accept the weight of freedom. Negative liberty. Negative liberty is the concept of freedom as non-interference. It refers to the absence of external obstacles, constraints, or coercion that prevent an individual from doing what they wish. When you have negative liberty, you are free in the sense that no one is stopping you from acting. This idea was made especially clear by political philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who contrasted it with positive liberty. In the context of negative liberty, freedom is defined by the space left alone by others, especially the government or institutions. If no one is restricting your choices, imposing rules, or physically preventing you from acting, you are seen as free. For example, if you want to write a book, negative liberty is the condition where no one stops you from doing so. There are no bans, no censors, and no punishments for your words. However, critics argue that negative liberty doesn't guarantee real opportunity. You might be legally free to act but still unable due to poverty, lack of education, or social pressures. Still, supporters value it as the foundation of a free society where individuals are left alone to pursue their own goals without interference. Positive liberty. Positive liberty is the idea of freedom as self-mastery, the ability to control and direct your own life, not just the absence of outside interference. It's about having the power and opportunity to realize your true potential, to act on your own values, and to shape your life according to your own will. Unlike negative liberty, which focuses on being left alone, positive liberty asks whether you are truly in control of yourself. Philosopher Isaiah Berlin described positive liberty as the freedom to be one's own master. This means more than just having options, it means being able to choose wisely and act meaningfully. It involves inner freedom from ignorance, fear, or compulsions that might limit your true autonomy. For example, someone who is free from addiction or internal conflict may have positive liberty, even if they are still constrained in other ways. Positive liberty has been both praised and criticized. Supporters say it empowers individuals to grow and flourish. Critics warn that governments or authorities might use it to justify control for your own good, deciding what your true self should be. Still, it remains a powerful vision of freedom tied to personal development and self-realization. Epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge. It asks fundamental questions such as, what is knowledge? How do we know what we know? Can we ever be certain? These questions may seem abstract, but they are deeply connected to how we understand the world, make decisions, and trust information. Traditionally, knowledge is defined as justified true belief. This means that to know something, it must be true, you must believe it, and you must have good reason or evidence for that belief. But even this definition is debated. Philosophers like Plato, Descartes, and more recently, Edmund Gettier have challenged and refined these ideas, showing how complicated it can be to define and prove knowledge. Epistemology also explores the limits of knowledge. Are there things we can never truly know? Can we trust our senses? What about knowledge from logic, intuition, or testimony? In today's world, where misinformation and doubt are common, epistemology helps us reflect critically on what counts as evidence and how we distinguish fact from opinion. At its heart, epistemology teaches us to be careful thinkers, aware of the difference between belief, assumption, and understanding. Metaphysics. Metaphysics is a fundamental branch of philosophy that explores the nature of reality beyond what we can see and measure. It asks questions about existence, the nature of objects, space, time, cause and effect, and what it means for something to be real. The term comes from Aristotle's works called After the Physics, where he examined things beyond physical science. Metaphysics deals with abstract concepts like whether the universe has a beginning, what the essence of things is, and if there are forces or entities beyond our senses. For example, it asks if mind and body are separate or the same, whether free will exists, or what the ultimate nature of reality might be. Though it can seem speculative, metaphysics forms the foundation for many other areas of philosophy and science. It helps us consider questions that science alone cannot fully answer, such as why is there something rather than nothing? Or what is the meaning of being? Metaphysics challenges us to look deeper at what underlies the world we experience. Aesthetics. Aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that studies beauty, art, and our experience of them. It explores questions like, what makes something beautiful? How do we judge art? Why do some things move us emotionally? Aesthetics is not just about pretty pictures or music, it is about understanding the nature of artistic expression and our emotional and sensory responses. Philosophers in this field analyze how art affects us, what counts as art, and whether beauty is objective or subjective. Some argue beauty is a universal quality found in harmony and balance, while others believe it depends entirely on personal or cultural tastes. Aesthetics also considers the meaning and value of creativity, imagination, and expression in human life. By reflecting on aesthetics, we gain insight into why humans create and appreciate art, and how art shapes our understanding of the world and ourselves. It connects with ethics and metaphysics by asking what role art plays in the good life and in revealing deeper truths. Ontology. Ontology is a branch of metaphysics that studies the nature of being, existence, and reality. It asks questions about what kinds of things exist and how they can be categorized. Ontology tries to understand what it means for something to be, and what kinds of entities make up the world. For example, ontology examines whether abstract things like numbers or concepts exist independently, or only in our minds. It also explores the difference between physical objects, like trees and chairs, and non-physical things, like ideas or emotions. Ontologists investigate whether categories such as person, animal, or object have a real basis or are just ways humans organize experience. This branch of philosophy influences many fields, including computer science, where ontologies help organize information. At its core, ontology pushes us to consider what fundamentally exists and how we relate to reality. It encourages deep reflection on the nature of existence itself, asking whether being is one thing or many, and how different things are connected. Logic. Logic is the study of correct reasoning and argumentation. It teaches us how to think clearly and systematically, helping to distinguish good arguments from bad ones. Logic examines the principles that govern valid inference, where conclusions follow from premises in a reliable way. At its core, logic deals with statements and their relationships, such as if, then conditions, contradictions, and equivalences. For example, if all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, logic allows us to conclude that Socrates is mortal. This kind of reasoning is fundamental to philosophy, mathematics, science, and everyday problem solving. There are different types of logic, including formal logic, which uses symbols and rules, and informal logic, which looks at everyday arguments. Learning logic sharpens our ability to analyze claims, spot fallacies, and construct coherent arguments. It's a foundational tool for critical thinking, enabling us to build knowledge on solid grounds. Ultimately, logic helps us navigate complex ideas and communicate them clearly, making it an essential part of human understanding. Dialectic. Dialectic is a method of dialogue and reasoning aimed at discovering truth through the exchange of opposing ideas. It involves a back-and-forth discussion where conflicting viewpoints are presented, questioned, and refined to reach a deeper understanding or synthesis. This method has roots in ancient philosophy, notably in the works of Socrates and Plato. Dialectic is not just about arguing, but about listening carefully and challenging assumptions in a respectful way. It helps reveal contradictions or hidden truths by exploring different perspectives. For example, one person might propose an idea, another opposes it with a counterargument, and through their exchange, both refine their views or find common ground. This process is valuable in philosophy, politics, and everyday problem solving because it encourages open-mindedness and critical thinking. Dialectic shows that truth often emerges not from isolated opinions but through dialogue and the tension between opposing ideas. It promotes growth by pushing us beyond simplistic answers toward more complex and thoughtful insights. Panpsychism. Panpsychism is the philosophical idea that consciousness or mind-like qualities are fundamental and present throughout all matter in the universe. This means that everything, from the smallest particles to the largest objects, has some form of experience or awareness, however simple it might be. Unlike traditional views that see consciousness as something unique to humans or animals, panpsychism suggests that consciousness is a basic feature of reality, much like space or time. This view helps address the hard problem of consciousness, which asks how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. Panpsychism avoids this by proposing that consciousness is not created by complex brains but is always part of matter itself. While particles don't think or feel like humans, they possess a very basic form of experience. Panpsychism challenges our usual separation between mind and matter and offers a way to bridge science and philosophy. It invites us to rethink how consciousness fits into the natural world, suggesting that mind and matter are deeply connected at every level of existence. Emergentism. Emergentism is a philosophical view that explains how complex systems and properties arise from simpler parts but cannot be fully reduced to them. It suggests that new qualities emerge when simpler elements interact in certain ways, creating something different and more complex than just the sum of those parts. For example, water has properties like wetness and fluidity that individual hydrogen and oxygen atoms do not possess on their own. In the context of mind and body, emergentism proposes that consciousness emerges from the complex interactions of brain cells. While neurons themselves are not conscious, Their combined activity produces the experience of awareness. This view tries to bridge the gap between physical processes and mental phenomena without reducing everything solely to physics. Emergentism is important because it recognizes both the power of physical science and the unique qualities of complex phenomena, like life and consciousness. It challenges strict reductionism, which claims that everything can be explained only by the parts. Instead, emergentism celebrates the new realities that arise at higher levels of organization, making it a popular perspective in philosophy, biology, and cognitive science. Materialism. Materialism is the philosophical view that everything that exists is made up of matter or physical substance. According to materialism, all phenomena, including thoughts, feelings, and consciousness, can ultimately be explained in terms of physical processes and interactions. This means that everything in the universe, from stars and planets to living beings and minds, is composed of matter following natural laws. Materialism rejects the idea of any separate spiritual or non-physical substance. It argues that the mind is not something beyond the body but arises from the brain's physical activity. This approach has been influential in science and philosophy because it encourages understanding the world through observation, experimentation, and physical explanation. Materialism helps ground discussions about reality and what can be tested and observed. However, critics argue that it struggles to fully explain subjective experiences and consciousness. Despite this, materialism remains a foundational position in many scientific and philosophical fields, supporting the idea that everything is part of the natural, physical world. Physicalism. Physicalism is the philosophical position that everything that exists is physical or depends on physical things. It closely relates to materialism but is broader, including not just matter but all entities described by physics, such as energy, forces, and spacetime. According to physicalism, everything, mind, consciousness, emotions, can ultimately be explained by physical laws and properties. Physicalism holds that the universe operates according to the principles of physics, and there is no need to invoke supernatural or non-physical explanations. For example, human thoughts and feelings arise from brain processes, which are physical events. This idea supports scientific approaches that seek to understand reality through measurable and testable phenomena. While physicalism is widely accepted in contemporary philosophy and science, it faces challenges, especially in explaining subjective experiences and consciousness, often called the hard problem. Nonetheless, physicalism remains a dominant framework because it unites diverse fields under one common principle, that everything is part of the physical world. Fatalism. Fatalism is the philosophical belief that all events are fixed in advance and inevitable, no matter what actions we take. It suggests that the future is predetermined, and human efforts cannot change the course of events. In this view, everything that happens is meant to happen, and free will is either an illusion or very limited. Fatalism differs from determinism, which says that events follow cause and effect but leaves some room for human choice within those causes. Fatalism, by contrast, stresses that outcomes are unchangeable regardless of our choices. This idea can be found in many cultures and religions, where fate or destiny governs life's path. Believing in fatalism can affect how people approach life. Some may feel powerless or resigned, while others find comfort in trusting that things will happen as they should. Philosophically, fatalism raises questions about moral responsibility, freedom, and whether we can influence our lives or must accept a fixed destiny. Moral relativism. Moral relativism is the idea that moral judgments and values are not absolute but depend on cultural, social, or personal perspectives. It means that what is considered right or wrong can vary between different societies or individuals, and no single moral code is universally true. According to moral relativism, ethical beliefs are shaped by context rather than fixed by objective standards. This view challenges the idea of universal moral truths, emphasizing tolerance and understanding of diverse ethical practices. For example, a behavior seen as acceptable in one culture might be viewed as wrong in another, and moral relativism encourages respect for these differences instead of judgment. However, critics argue that moral relativism can lead to confusion or the inability to criticize harmful actions if everything is relative. Supporters maintain it helps avoid dogmatism and promotes empathy. Overall, Moral relativism invites us to recognize the complexity of moral life and consider how values are influenced by history, culture, and individual experiences. Cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is the philosophical idea that a person's beliefs, values, and practices should be understood based on that person's own culture, rather than judged against the standards of another culture. It encourages us to view cultural differences with openness and avoid imposing our own cultural norms as universal. This approach helps explain why customs and moral codes vary widely across societies. For example, a tradition considered normal and respectful in one culture might seem strange or wrong in another. Cultural relativism teaches that these differences reflect unique histories, environments, and social structures. By promoting tolerance, cultural relativism discourages ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own culture is superior. It challenges us to appreciate diversity and understand people in their cultural context. However, it also raises difficult questions about whether any practices, such as human rights violations, can or should be criticized if they are culturally accepted. Cultural relativism plays an important role in anthropology, ethics, and international relations, reminding us that understanding and respect are key to peaceful coexistence in a diverse world. The state of nature. The state of nature is a philosophical concept used to describe the hypothetical condition of human beings before the establishment of society or government. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau use this idea to explore what life would be like without laws, rules, or authority. In the state of nature, humans are free and equal but face challenges about safety, property, and cooperation. Hobbes saw this state as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, where life was full of conflict and fear. For him, government was necessary to maintain order and protect people. Locke, on the other hand, believed the state of nature was mostly peaceful, governed by natural rights, but that people formed governments to better protect their property and freedoms. Rousseau imagined it as a time of innocence and freedom corrupted by society. The state of nature helps us understand why governments exist and what kind of social contracts justify authority. It raises questions about human nature, freedom, and the origins of political power. Alienation. Alienation is a philosophical concept that describes a feeling of separation or estrangement people experience from themselves, others, or their work. It often occurs when individuals feel disconnected from the things that give their lives meaning or purpose. The idea was famously explored by Karl Marx, who argued that in capitalist societies, workers become alienated because they do not control the products of their labor and feel like cogs in a machine rather than creative beings. Alienation can happen in many ways. A person may feel alienated from their own identity, as if they are living someone else's life or acting against their true nature. They might feel isolated from other people, experiencing loneliness despite social interaction. It can also mean feeling detached from the work one does, where labor becomes repetitive and meaningless. This concept highlights the emotional and psychological impact of social structures on human well-being. Alienation challenges us to think about how society and work can be organized so that people feel more connected, empowered, and fulfilled. Reification. Reification is a philosophical concept that means treating abstract ideas, social relations, or human qualities as if they were concrete things. The term comes from the Latin word res, meaning thing. It describes how people sometimes mistake social constructs or complex processes for fixed, natural objects. For example, in capitalist societies, money or markets are often treated as if they have power on their own, rather than being the result of human actions and agreements. Reification can make us forget that social institutions and relationships are created by people and can be changed. This idea was developed by thinkers like Georg Lukács and Karl Marx, who argued that reification hides the real human and social nature of economic and political systems. It can lead to alienation, because people start seeing themselves and others as objects or roles instead of individuals. Understanding reification helps us recognize the ways we might unconsciously accept social systems as unchangeable and encourages critical thinking about the structures that shape our lives. Language games. Language games is a concept introduced by philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. It refers to the idea that the meaning of words is shaped by how they are used in specific social situations, much like moves in a game. Just as different games have different rules, different types of communication have their own patterns and expectations. For example, the way we use words in a courtroom is very different from how we use them with friends, at a market, or in a classroom. Wittgenstein argued that language does not get its meaning from simply labeling objects or pointing to definitions. Instead, meaning is created through use. Words gain their sense in the game they are a part of. This idea helps explain why language can be flexible, context-dependent, and sometimes even confusing when taken out of its proper setting. Understanding language as a collection of overlapping games helps clarify how we communicate, how misunderstandings happen, and how deeply language is tied to our actions and life practices. It moves philosophy away from trying to define words in fixed ways and instead focuses on how language functions in real life. Family resemblance. Family resemblance is a concept introduced by Ludwig Wittgenstein to explain how words and ideas can be connected without sharing one single defining feature. Instead of looking for one essence that all things in a category must share, Wittgenstein suggested we think of them like members of a family. Just as family members might have overlapping features, like the same nose, hair, or smile, not all will share every trait, but the group still clearly belongs together. For example, think of the word game. Some games involve competition, others don't. Some have rules, others are played freely. Some are physical, and some are mental. There is no single feature that defines all games, yet we understand what the word means through the overlapping similarities between examples. This approach avoids rigid definitions and instead focuses on the patterns that emerge across uses. Family resemblance helps us understand the flexibility and richness of language. It also challenges the idea that every concept must have strict boundaries. Instead, it invites us to see how meaning grows from use, context, and connection. The liar paradox. The liar paradox is a famous philosophical puzzle that arises when a statement refers to itself in a way that creates a contradiction. The classic example is the sentence, "This statement is false." If the statement is true, then what it says must hold, so it must be false. But if it's false, then what it says isn't true, which means it must be true. The sentence loops back on itself and creates a paradox where it can't consistently be labeled as either true or false. This paradox challenges our basic understanding of truth, language, and logic. It shows that self-reference in language can create problems that don't seem to have a clear solution. Philosophers and logicians have used the liar paradox to explore the limits of language, the structure of logical systems, and the nature of truth itself. Modern approaches to this paradox include developing more careful systems of logic that prevent these kinds of self-referential loops, or accepting that some statements may be neither true nor false. The liar paradox remains a powerful example of how even simple sentences can reveal deep problems in how we think and communicate. The paradox of tolerance. The paradox of tolerance is the idea that a society that values tolerance above all must sometimes be intolerant of intolerance in order to survive. The concept was introduced by philosopher Karl Popper, who argued that if a society allows unlimited tolerance, even for ideas that promote hatred or violence, it risks being destroyed by those very ideas. At first, this may sound contradictory. How can a tolerant society justify silencing anyone? But Popper's point is that tolerance should not be extended to those who seek to eliminate tolerance itself. If extremists are allowed to spread hatred freely, they may eventually gain enough power to suppress the rights of others, leading to an intolerant and oppressive system. This paradox forces us to think carefully about the limits of free speech and the balance between open dialogue and protecting democratic values. It raises important ethical and political questions. When does tolerance endanger freedom? And how should a free society defend itself without becoming authoritarian? The paradox of tolerance is not about rejecting free expression but about protecting it from those who would use it to destroy the very freedoms it depends on. Moral luck. Moral luck is a philosophical concept that explores how factors beyond a person's control can influence how we judge their actions morally. It seems natural to believe that people should only be judged based on what they intend or control. However, in real life, we often assign praise or blame based on the outcomes of actions, even when those outcomes are due to luck. For example, consider two people who both drive drunk. One gets home safely. the other accidentally hits someone. Even if both made the same bad choice, we tend to blame the one who caused harm much more, even though the difference was a matter of luck. This reveals a tension in how we think about responsibility. Philosophers like Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams have explored how deeply luck is involved in everything from our character and upbringing to the situations we face. Moral luck challenges the idea of pure moral responsibility and suggests that our judgments are more complex than they seem. It invites us to question whether fairness is possible in moral evaluations and how we should treat people whose intentions were the same, but whose outcomes differed. The tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is a concept that describes how shared resources become depleted when individuals act in their own self-interest rather than considering the collective good. The term was popularized by ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968, though the underlying idea traces back centuries. The scenario typically involves a common resource, such as grazing land, fisheries, or clean air, that is accessible to everyone but owned by no one. Each individual user has an incentive to maximize their personal benefit from the resource, whether that means grazing more cattle, catching more fish, or emitting more pollution. However, when everyone pursues this strategy simultaneously, the resource becomes overexploited and eventually destroyed, leaving everyone worse off than if they had cooperated. This phenomenon illustrates the fundamental tension between individual rationality and collective welfare. The tragedy occurs not because people are malicious, but because the structure of the situation creates perverse incentives. Solutions often require some form of regulation, privatization, or community management to align individual incentives with collective sustainability. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias where people with limited knowledge or competence in a particular area greatly overestimate their own knowledge or competence in that area. Named after psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who first described it in 1999, this effect occurs because the same skills needed to be competent in a domain are often the same skills needed to evaluate competence in that domain. When someone lacks these skills, they cannot accurately assess their own abilities. The effect typically follows a predictable pattern. Beginners start with high confidence despite low ability, then as they learn more, their confidence drops as they realize how much they don't know. Eventually, with genuine expertise comes more accurate self-assessment. This phenomenon helps explain why inexperienced individuals often feel more confident than experts, who are acutely aware of the complexities and limitations in their field. The effect has significant implications for education, decision-making, and professional development, highlighting the importance of seeking feedback and maintaining intellectual humility. The just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is a cognitive bias that leads people to believe the world is fundamentally fair and that people generally get what they deserve. This psychological phenomenon was first described by social psychologist Melvin Lerner in the 1960s. According to this belief system, good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, creating a sense that the universe operates according to moral principles of justice and fairness. While this belief can provide psychological comfort and a sense of control, it often leads to victim blaming and a lack of empathy for those who suffer misfortune. When confronted with evidence of injustice or random suffering, people may rationalize these events by assuming the victims must have done something to deserve their fate. This bias can manifest in various ways, from blaming poverty on personal failings rather than systemic issues, to assuming that accident victims were somehow careless. The just world hypothesis serves as a defense mechanism against the uncomfortable reality that life can be arbitrary and unfair, but it can also perpetuate harmful stereotypes and prevent people from addressing real injustices. Infinite regress. Infinite regress is a philosophical problem that occurs when a proposed solution to a question creates the same type of question, leading to an endless chain of explanations that never reaches a satisfactory conclusion. This logical difficulty arises when each answer requires a further answer of the same kind, creating a potentially infinite sequence. For example, if someone asks what caused the universe, and the answer is God, then the question becomes what caused God, and so on indefinitely. The problem appears in various philosophical domains, from causation and justification to the nature of consciousness and meaning. In epistemology, infinite regress challenges how we can ever truly know anything, since every piece of knowledge seems to require prior knowledge for its justification. Philosophers have proposed several responses to this challenge, including foundationalism, which argues for basic beliefs that don't require further justification, and coherentism, which suggests that beliefs can be justified by their mutual support within a coherent system. Some argue that infinite regress is not necessarily problematic, while others see it as proof that certain types of questions are fundamentally unanswerable or incorrectly posed. The hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is a philosophical challenge that questions how and why physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective, first-person experiences. Coined by philosopher David Chalmers in the 1990s, this problem distinguishes between the easy problems of consciousness, which involve explaining cognitive functions like attention, memory, and perception, and the hard problem, which concerns the existence of subjective experience itself. While neuroscience can increasingly explain how the brain processes information, integrates sensory data, and controls behavior, it remains unclear why there should be any inner, felt experience accompanying these processes. The hard problem asks why there is something it is like to see red, feel pain, or taste coffee, rather than these processes occurring without any subjective dimension. This mystery touches on fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the relationship between mind and matter, and whether consciousness can ever be fully reduced to physical processes. Various theories attempt to address this problem, from materialist approaches that deny consciousness is truly mysterious, to panpsychist theories that suggest consciousness is a fundamental property of all matter, to dualist positions that maintain consciousness is non-physical. Qualia. Qualia refers to the subjective, experiential qualities of conscious states that are immediately accessible to the individual experiencing them, but seemingly impossible to communicate fully to others. These are the what-it's-like aspects of mental experiences, such as the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, or the taste of chocolate. Qualia represent the qualitative, phenomenal properties of experiences that distinguish them from their physical or functional descriptions. For instance, while we can describe the wavelength of light that produces the color red, or map the neural activity associated with seeing red, the actual subjective experience of redness appears to be something additional and irreducible. This concept is central to debates about consciousness because qualia seem to resist objective, scientific description despite being fundamental to our mental lives. Philosophers debate whether qualia actually exist as distinct properties or whether they can be explained away through physicalist theories. The problem of qualia highlights the explanatory gap between objective, third-person scientific descriptions and subjective, first-person experiences. Some argue that qualia are proof that consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical processes, while others contend that apparent qualia will eventually be explained through neuroscience and cognitive science. Intentionally. Intentionally is the philosophical concept that describes the capacity of mental states to be directed toward, refer to, or be about objects, properties, or states of affairs in the world. Originally developed by medieval philosophers and later revived by Franz Brentano in the 19th century, intentionally is considered a defining characteristic of consciousness and mental phenomena. When you think about your grandmother, fear a snake, or desire pizza, your mental states exhibit intentionally because they are directed towards specific objects or contents. This aboutness or directedness distinguishes mental states from purely physical states, which do not inherently refer to anything beyond themselves. Intentionally encompasses various mental attitudes including beliefs, desires, hopes, fears, and perceptions, all of which are directed toward intentional objects. Importantly, these intentional objects need not exist in reality. You can think about unicorns or fear imaginary monsters. This raises complex questions about the relationship between mind and world, and how mental states can refer to non-existent objects. Contemporary philosophers debate whether intentionally can be reduced to physical processes or whether it represents an irreducible feature of consciousness that distinguishes the mental from the physical realm. The absurd. The absurd is a philosophical concept, particularly associated with Albert Camus, that describes the fundamental conflict between human desire for meaning and purpose and the universe's apparent indifference to these needs. This condition arises from the collision between our deep-seated need to find rational explanations, coherent values, and ultimate significance in existence, and a world that offers none of these things definitively. The absurd is not simply the absence of meaning, but rather the confrontation between our meaning-seeking nature and a silent, seemingly meaningless universe. Camus argued that this recognition leads to three possible responses: suicide, which he rejected as philosophical defeat, philosophical suicide through religious or ideological leap of faith, which he saw as intellectual dishonesty, or acceptance of the absurd condition while continuing to live fully. He advocated for the third option, suggesting we should embrace our situation like Sisyphus eternally pushing his boulder, finding rebellion, freedom, and passion in the very act of living despite meaninglessness. The absurd does not lead to despair but to a heightened appreciation for human experience and the creation of our own values through authentic living. Mind uploading. Mind uploading is a theoretical concept that proposes transferring or copying the contents of a human mind, including memories, personality, and consciousness, into a digital format or artificial substrate. This futuristic idea suggests that human consciousness could potentially be preserved, duplicated, or transferred to computers, robots, or other non-biological systems. The concept assumes that the mind is fundamentally informational and that consciousness emerges from the pattern of neural connections and activities in the brain, rather than from the specific biological material itself. Proponents argue that if we can map and simulate the complete neural structure of a brain with sufficient detail, we could recreate the same conscious experience in a digital environment. This would theoretically allow for digital immortality, enhanced cognitive abilities, and freedom from biological limitations. However, mind uploading raises profound philosophical questions about personal identity, continuity of consciousness, and what it means to be human. Critics debate whether an uploaded mind would truly be the same person or merely a copy, whether consciousness can be reduced to computational processes, and whether the subjective experience of being uploaded would be preserved or lost in the transition from biological to digital existence. Transhumanism. Transhumanism is a philosophical and cultural movement that advocates for the enhancement of human capabilities through technology, ultimately aiming to transcend current biological limitations and evolve into a post-human condition. This ideology embraces the use of science and technology to improve human physical, cognitive, and emotional capacities, extending healthy lifespan, and potentially achieving forms of digital immortality. Transhumanists argue that humans should not accept their current biological constraints as permanent, but should actively work to overcome aging, disease, death, and cognitive limitations through genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and other emerging technologies. The movement envisions a future where enhanced humans or posthumans possess dramatically improved intelligence, physical abilities, emotional resilience, and lifespans measured in centuries or millennia. Key goals include eliminating involuntary suffering, extending healthy human lifespan indefinitely, and enhancing human cognitive and physical capabilities. However, transhumanism raises significant ethical questions about equality, human nature, and the risks of such technologies. Critics worry about creating new forms of inequality, losing essential human qualities, or facing unintended consequences from radical technological interventions. Despite these concerns, transhumanists maintain that the potential benefits justify pursuing these enhancements while addressing associated risks responsibly. Simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis proposes that what we experience as reality might actually be an artificial simulation, similar to a sophisticated computer program or virtual reality environment. This concept gained prominence through philosopher Nick Bostrom's 2003 argument, which suggested that if advanced civilizations developed the computational power to run detailed simulations of their ancestors, they would likely run many such simulations. Given this scenario, there would be far more simulated beings than real ones, making it statistically more probable that we are among the simulated rather than the original beings. The hypothesis draws on rapid advances in computing power, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence, suggesting that sufficiently advanced technology could create simulations indistinguishable from reality to their inhabitants. This idea has roots in ancient philosophical skepticism, from Plato's cave allegory to Descartes' evil demon, but modern technology gives it new relevance. The simulation hypothesis raises profound questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and knowledge. If true, it would challenge our understanding of physics, mortality, and meaning. Some argue we should take the possibility seriously and look for evidence, while others contend it's unfalsifiable and therefore scientifically meaningless, though philosophically intriguing. Animal rights. Animal rights is a philosophical position that argues non-human animals possess inherent moral status and should be granted fundamental protections based on their capacity for suffering, consciousness, or other morally relevant characteristics. This perspective extends beyond animal welfare, which focuses on humane treatment, to assert that animals have rights that should not be violated regardless of human interests or benefits. Philosophers like Peter Singer and Tom Regan have developed influential frameworks supporting animal rights, with Singer emphasizing the capacity for suffering as the basis for moral consideration, while Regan argues that animals are subjects of a life with inherent value. The animal rights movement challenges traditional human-centered ethics, questioning practices like factory farming, animal experimentation, hunting, and entertainment uses of animals. Advocates argue that if we accept that unnecessary suffering is wrong, then we must extend this principle to all sentient beings capable of experiencing pain and pleasure. This philosophical position raises complex questions about moral boundaries, the nature of consciousness across species, and how to balance competing interests. Critics argue that animal rights positions may be too extreme or impractical, while supporters contend that current treatment of animals represents a massive moral failing that future generations will judge harshly. Deep ecology. Deep ecology is an environmental philosophy that advocates for the intrinsic value of all living beings and natural systems, regardless of their utility to human purposes. Developed by Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss in the 1970s, this approach distinguishes itself from shallow environmentalism, which focuses primarily on pollution and resource depletion as they affect human welfare. Deep ecology argues that nature has value in itself, independent of human interests, and that all organisms and entities in the ecosphere are interconnected parts of a larger whole. This philosophy promotes biocentric equality, suggesting that humans are not inherently more valuable than other species or natural systems. Deep ecologists advocate for significant reductions in human population and consumption, arguing that current lifestyles are unsustainable and destructive to the planet's ecological integrity. The movement emphasizes the need for profound changes in human consciousness and values, moving away from anthropocentric thinking toward an ecocentric worldview that recognizes the inherent worth of wilderness, biodiversity, and natural processes. Critics argue that deep ecology may be impractical or misanthropic, while supporters contend that only such fundamental shifts in perspective can address the root causes of environmental crisis and create a truly sustainable relationship between humans and nature. Ecocentrism. Ecocentrism is an environmental philosophy that places ecosystems and the natural environment at the center of moral consideration, rather than individual organisms or human interests. This perspective argues that ecological wholes such as species, ecosystems, and the biosphere itself possess intrinsic value and moral standing that should guide human behavior and decision-making. Unlike anthropocentric views that prioritize human welfare, or biocentric approaches that focus on individual living beings, ecocentrism emphasizes the integrity, stability, and beauty of ecological communities as the ultimate source of value. This philosophy recognizes that individual organisms, including humans, derive their significance from their roles within larger ecological systems. Ecocentrists argue that preserving biodiversity, maintaining ecological balance, and protecting natural processes should take precedence over individual interests when conflicts arise. The approach draws from ecological science, showing how all life depends on healthy ecosystems and natural cycles. This perspective influences environmental policy discussions about wilderness preservation, species protection, and climate change response. Critics argue that ecocentrism may justify sacrificing individual welfare for ecosystem health, while supporters contend that recognizing ecological value is essential for long-term survival and environmental sustainability in an interconnected world. The butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is a concept from chaos theory that describes how small changes in initial conditions can lead to vastly different outcomes in complex systems. The term was popularized by meteorologist Edward Lorenz, who discovered that tiny variations in weather data could produce dramatically different weather predictions. The name comes from the metaphorical example that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could theoretically cause a tornado in Texas through a chain of atmospheric interactions. This phenomenon illustrates the sensitive dependence on initial conditions that characterizes chaotic systems, where outcomes are deterministic but practically unpredictable due to the exponential amplification of small differences. The butterfly effect has profound implications beyond meteorology, appearing in economics, ecology, psychology, and history, where minor events can trigger major consequences. It suggests that complex systems are inherently unpredictable over long periods, even when governed by deterministic laws. This concept challenges linear thinking and highlights the interconnectedness of events in complex systems. The butterfly effect also raises philosophical questions about causation, responsibility, and the nature of prediction in an interconnected world. It demonstrates that in nonlinear systems, proportionality between cause and effect breaks down, making long-term forecasting fundamentally limited. Supervenience. Supervenience is a philosophical concept that describes a specific type of dependence relationship between two sets of properties or phenomena, where one level supervenes on another if there cannot be a change in the supervening properties without a corresponding change in the base properties. This relationship is commonly expressed as no difference above without difference below. The concept is particularly important in philosophy of mind, where mental properties are often said to supervene on physical properties, meaning that any change in mental states must correspond to some change in physical brain states, even though mental properties may not be reducible to physical ones. Supervenience allows philosophers to acknowledge dependence while avoiding strong reductionism. For example, if consciousness supervenes on neural activity, then identical brain states must produce identical conscious experiences, but this doesn't necessarily mean consciousness is nothing but neural activity. The concept appears across various philosophical domains, from aesthetics, where beauty might supervene on physical properties, to ethics, where moral properties might supervene on natural facts. Supervenience provides a middle ground between complete independence and full reduction, allowing higher-level properties to depend on lower-level ones while maintaining their distinctiveness and potentially emergent characteristics. Thought experiment. A thought experiment is a hypothetical scenario used in philosophy, science, and other disciplines to explore ideas, test theories, and clarify concepts through imagination rather than physical experimentation. These mental exercises involve constructing imaginary situations that isolate specific variables or principles to examine their implications and consequences. Famous examples include Plato's Cave, which explores the nature of reality and knowledge, Schrödinger's cat, which highlights quantum mechanics paradoxes, and the Trolley Problem, which examines moral decision-making. Thought experiments are particularly valuable when physical experiments are impossible, impractical, or unethical, allowing researchers to explore theoretical possibilities and their logical consequences. They serve multiple functions, clarifying conceptual distinctions, testing the consistency of theories, generating intuitions about complex problems, and revealing hidden assumptions in our thinking. The power of thought experiments lies in their ability to strip away irrelevant details and focus on essential features of a problem. However, they also have limitations, as their conclusions depend on the accuracy of our intuitions and the validity of the imagined scenarios. Critics argue that thought experiments can be misleading if they rely on unrealistic assumptions or fail to capture the complexity of real-world situations. Dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is a philosophical framework developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that combines materialist philosophy with dialectical method to understand social change and historical development. This approach argues that material conditions, rather than ideas or consciousness, are the primary drivers of historical change and social development. The materialist aspect emphasizes that economic structures, production methods, and class relations form the foundation of society, while ideas, culture, and politics emerge from these material bases. The dialectical component, borrowed from Hegel but inverted, describes how contradictions within material conditions lead to conflict and eventual transformation. According to this view, history progresses through the resolution of contradictions between opposing forces, such as different social classes with conflicting interests. Marx applied this framework to analyze capitalism, arguing that its internal contradictions between capital and labor would eventually lead to its overthrow and replacement by socialism. Dialectical materialism presents history as a process of constant change driven by material contradictions rather than great ideas or individual actions. This philosophy influenced revolutionary movements worldwide and continues to shape critical analysis of economic and social systems, though it has also faced criticism for its deterministic implications and predictions about capitalism's inevitable collapse. Praxis. Praxis is a philosophical concept that refers to the integration of theory and practice, emphasizing that knowledge and action should be united rather than separated. Originally developed in ancient Greek philosophy and later elaborated by Marx and other critical theorists, praxis describes the process through which theoretical understanding is applied to transform real-world conditions, while practical experience simultaneously informs and refines theoretical knowledge. This concept challenges the traditional academic separation between abstract thinking and concrete action, arguing that genuine understanding emerges only through engaged practice. Marx emphasized that philosophers should not merely interpret the world but should work to change it, making praxis central to his critique of purely theoretical philosophy. In this view, theory without practice becomes sterile intellectualism, while practice without theory becomes blind activism. Praxis involves critical reflection on action and active engagement with ideas, creating a dynamic relationship where theory guides practice and practice tests and develops theory. This concept has influenced education, where it emphasizes experiential learning and critical pedagogy, as well as social movements that combine intellectual analysis with political action. Contemporary applications of praxis can be found in fields ranging from liberation theology to community organizing, where practitioners seek to unite scholarly understanding with transformative social engagement.